The next day, she arrived with punctuality that was almost unsettling. A tall, striking woman, dressed plainly but impeccably. Her presence radiated an air of confidence, one that was impossible to ignore. There was no doubt that she was someone who meant business, someone who was determined to carve her way through the world. I'll admit, I wasn't one to be easily swayed by the so-called new woman of the times. Even though she possessed undeniable beauty, I found myself indifferent, almost skeptical of her purpose. But I kept that to myself, unsure of how this conversation would unfold. She wasted no time and began speaking, her tone steady and assured. "My business is somewhat unusual," she said, taking a seat and smoothing her skirt. "If you'll allow me, I'll start from the beginning." The weight of her words hung in the air. "Mademoiselle," she continued, her voice steady, almost cold, "I am an orphan. My father was one of two brothers, both sons of a humble farmer in Devonshire. The farm was poor, and the eldest brother, Andrew, immigrated to Australia. There, through sharp speculation and a bit of luck, he made his fortune." She paused, her eyes distant, as if reliving a past that still haunted her. "My father, Roger, was different. He had no interest in the land, only in the opportunities the world could offer. He managed to educate himself, securing a humble job as a clerk. He married my mother, a woman of little means, the daughter of a struggling artist. My father died when I was 6, and by 14, my mother followed him into the grave." Her gaze sharpened, and the words seemed to come with more intensity. "The only relative I had left was my Uncle Andrew, a man who returned from Australia and bought a modest estate called Crabtree Manor. Despite the name, it was nothing grand. More a farmhouse, really. But to me, it was everything. And despite the roughness of the life, he showed me kindness, treated me as though I were his own daughter." Her lips curled into a faint smile, as if recalling the bittersweet memories. "But it wasn't easy. My uncle, a man of few words and less education, was obsessed with farming. He had his own ideas about how women should be raised. He believed girls should be taught practical tasks, housework, dairy work, and to stay far from anything that could be called book learning. He didn't believe in the need for formal education for women, and that's where the conflict began." A sigh escaped her lips as she leaned forward, the fire in her eyes betraying the passion she had long kept under wraps. "I fought him, of course. I knew I had a mind for something greater than what his world offered, but there was no easy way out. He was stubborn, and so was I." She met my gaze now, unflinching. "But in the end, I managed to win a scholarship. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And then the crisis came. I made up my mind. I was going to go to Girton. I had a small inheritance from my mother, just enough to set me on my path. And no matter the cost, I was determined to use the gifts I'd been given." Her voice lowered, becoming softer yet more intense. But that's when the final argument came. It was the one that changed everything. My uncle put the facts before me, with no hesitation, and that was when the world I knew began to unravel. "My uncle," she said, "had no children of his own, and so it was clear I was to be his heir. He was an exceedingly rich man, after all. But," she paused, the weight of her words sinking in, "if I persisted in these newfangled notions of mine, I was to expect nothing from him." She glanced up at me, her eyes calculating, unflinching. I remained polite but firm, as I always do. I told him that while I would always be deeply attached to him, I needed to lead my own life. We parted on that note, but his last words were— She paused again, her voice dropping slightly as if recalling the sting of the memory. "You fancy your brains, my girl," he said. "I've no book learning, But for all that, I'll pit mine against yours any day. We'll see what we shall see." She took a deep breath, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. That was 9 years ago. Since then, I stayed with him for the occasional weekend. Our relations were amicable enough, though his views never wavered. He never mentioned my matriculation nor my degree. Her eyes darkened as she added, "For the last 3 years, his health had been failing. A month ago, he passed away, and that brings me to the point of my visit." The atmosphere shifted again as she leaned forward, her voice growing more urgent, almost as if she were revealing a secret, one that could change everything. "My uncle left behind a most extraordinary will," she said, eyes gleaming with the thrill of it. "By the terms of that will, Crabtree Manor and all its contents are to be at my disposal for 1 year following his death. But," she raised a finger, her face becoming more serious, "there's a catch. During this year, I am to prove my wits. The actual words are—" She pulled out a piece of paper from her bag and read aloud. "At the end of that period, my niece's wits having proved better than hers, the house and all my uncle's large fortune shall pass to various charitable institutions." There was a brief silence. It hung in the air like a heavy fog. Then I heard Puo's voice, breaking the tension. "That seems rather harsh, considering you were Mr. Marsh's only blood relative." But the woman, Miss Marsh, was resolute. "I do not view it that way. Uncle Andrew warned me, quite fairly, and I chose my own path. Since I wouldn't fall in with his wishes, he was well within his rights to leave his fortune to whomever he chose." She smiled, a tight, knowing smile. "The will, however, it wasn't drawn up by a lawyer. No, it was written on a standard printed will form, and witnessed by the man and his wife who lived in the house and cared for him." She raised an eyebrow, the mystery deepening. "That's why I've come to you. I need your help. There may be a chance, however small, to upset the terms of the will, but I wouldn't attempt it alone." Puo looked intrigued but cautious. "You regard it as a sort of challenge, then?" he asked. "Exactly," she replied. "A sporting challenge, if you will." I could feel the tension between them, the unspoken understanding that this wasn't just about money. It was about something far deeper. "Somewhere in this rambling old manor," she continued, her eyes glinting with purpose, "Uncle Andrew has concealed either a sum of money, perhaps in notes, or maybe even a second will. And he's given me a year to find it, to prove my wits." I could almost see the fire in her as she spoke, a deep desire to outsmart her late uncle's test, to solve the riddle he had left behind. "Exactly, Em," she said, her tone light but knowing. "And I'm paying you the compliment of assuming that your ingenuity will be greater than mine." Puo chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Very charming," he said. "My gray cells are at your disposal." "Have you made a search yourself?" he asked, eyes narrowing. Miss Marsh shook her head. "Only a cursory one, but I have too much respect for my uncle's sharp mind to believe that this task will be an easy one. And besides," she trailed off, looking away, "he always loved puzzles." "Do you have the will, or a copy of it?" Puo asked, leaning forward with curiosity. Miss Marsh handed a document across the table. Puo quickly skimmed it, nodding to himself. "3 years ago," he said thoughtfully. "Dated March the 25th, 11 a.m. A very suggestive detail." He handed it back to her, his mind clearly already at work, turning over the possibilities. As for Miss Marsh, she leaned back, her gaze unwavering. This was only the beginning of a game that was far from over. And somehow I could sense that the manor, with its secrets hidden in every creaky floorboard, would soon reveal its dark, twisting story. "Ah, this certainly narrows the field of our search," Puo remarked, his voice filled with a calculated assurance. It must be another will. A second will, one made even half an hour later, could shatter this entire scheme. He leaned in, the glint in his eye more intense than before. A charming and ingenious problem you've presented, mademoiselle. I must admit I find great pleasure in solving it. His vanity, however, couldn't be masked. Granted, your uncle was a man of considerable ability, but surely his gray cells could not have been on the level of Hercule Poirot's. He smiled, clearly pleased with himself, the confidence spilling over into his every word. Fortunately, he continued, the air thick with intrigue, I have no pressing matters at hand. Hastings and I shall go down to Crabtree Manor tonight. He paused, eyeing Miss Marsh. The Baker couple, who attended your uncle, are still here, I presume? Yes, she responded, her eyes betraying no emotion, but something flickered there, perhaps anticipation. Their name is Baker. The next morning, the hunt began in earnest. We had arrived late the night before. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, having received a telegram from Miss Marsh, were waiting for us. They greeted us warmly. Mr. Baker, a man with a face as pink and crinkled as an overripe apple, and his wife, a robust woman of impressive proportions, had clearly prepared for our arrival. Despite our long journey, including an 8-mile drive from the station, we'd quickly retired to bed after a hearty supper of roast chicken, apple pie, and cream. Now, fully rested, we were seated in a small paneled room that had once been Mr. Marsh's study. It had the look of a man who prided himself on order and precision. A large roll-top desk stood against the wall, stuffed with neatly docketed papers, each one organized with a care that bordered on obsession. A big leather armchair, worn with the imprint of its owner's use, sat in the corner, the seat seeming to remember the man who had once inhabited it. A chintz-covered couch ran along the opposite wall, its deep cushions worn with time, and the window seats, plush with faded chintz fabric, seemed to hold memories of quiet afternoons long ago. Poirot, ever the methodical man, lit one of his tiny cigarettes, the smoke curling lazily around him as he surveyed the room. "We must map out our plan of campaign," he said, his voice soft but full of authority. "I've already made a rough survey of the house, but I'm inclined to think that any clue, any hidden will be found right here, in this very room." He walked around the desk, his gloved hands hovering over the neatly stacked documents. "We shall need to go through every single piece of paper in this desk with meticulous care. Naturally, I don't expect to find the will among them, but it is highly probable that some innocuous-looking document will conceal the vital clue, perhaps the key to the will's hiding place." He turned back to Miss Marsh, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "But first, we must gather information. Ring the bell, please." As I reached for the bell, Poirot moved about the room, his eyes scanning every detail, each one seeming to deepen the mystery. There was something almost sacred in the way he inspected the room, as though every item, the neatly docketed papers, the keys with their ivory labels, the china cabinet with its precisely arranged contents, spoke to him of a methodical mind and an eye for detail. "See," he said, as if finding something particularly satisfying, "how the packets of papers are so neatly docketed, each drawer labeled with such care. Even the china cabinet has its key labeled, and the china within it is arranged with such precision. It rejoices the heart." But then, in an instant, he paused. The air shifted, thick with an unspoken tension. His gaze grew more intense as he walked closer to the desk, as if something, some subtle clue, had caught his eye. A shadow seemed to hang in the air, the very room holding its breath, and I couldn't help but feel that something was about to unfold. A secret. a mystery far deeper than any of us had expected. "What is it, Poirot?" I asked, the mystery in his voice compelling me. He didn't answer immediately, but his hand lingered near the desk. "Ah," he finally murmured, his voice trailing off as if to himself. "There is more to this room than meets the eye. But we must be careful, Hastings. We are not alone here." And just like that, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker, as though the walls themselves were hiding something far more sinister than just the will of a wealthy man. The hunt had only just begun. Poirot's sharp eyes were drawn to something unusual, the key of the desk, but what caught his attention even more was the dirty envelope affixed to it. He furrowed his brow, his gaze sharpening as he withdrew the key from the lock. Written in a crabbed, hurried handwriting, quite unlike the neat script on the other keys, were the words, "Key of roll-top desk." "An alien note," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. His fingers lightly traced the paper as though testing the very nature of the message. I would swear this is no longer the handwriting of Mr. Marsh. I could sense the wheels turning in Poirot's mind, and I had to ask, but who else could it be? Poirot gave me a sharp look, his voice low, filled with mystery. Who else, indeed? Only Miss Marsh, I believe, and she too is a lady of order, of method. Before we could delve further into this unsettling discovery, the door opened, and Baker, the manservant, appeared in answer to the bell. "Fetch Madame, your wife," Poirot instructed calmly. "We have a few questions." A few moments passed before Mrs. Baker arrived, wiping her hands on her apron, her face lit up with an eager smile. Despite the warmth of their welcome, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Poirot wasted no time, quickly outlining the purpose of our visit. The Bakers listened intently, their sympathy for Miss Marsh clear in their expressions. "We don't want to see Miss Violet done out of what's hers," Mrs. Baker declared, her voice tinged with a quiet resolve. "Cruel it would be, for sure. Hard for hospitals to get it." Poirot nodded, his gaze never leaving the couple. He began his questioning with a sharp, probing precision. Yes, Mr. Baker confirmed, nodding with certainty. "I remember perfectly witnessing the will." Poirot pressed on. "Baker, had you ever been to the neighboring town?" "Yes, sir. I was sent to fetch 2 printed will forms," Baker replied. "2?" Poirot's tone grew more intense. "For safety?" "Aye, in case one should be spoiled," Baker explained. And sure enough, he did spoil one of them. Poirot's mind was already leaping ahead. And what time of day was this? Baker scratched his head, a slight frown pulling at his brow. But Mrs. Baker, always quick to respond, interjected, "It was just after I put the milk on for the cocoa, around 11, I think. I remember it well. The milk boiled over on the stove while us got back." Poirot's eyes glimmered with intrigue. "And after this incident, did your master ask you to sign again?" Mrs. Baker's eyes twinkled with the memory. "Yes, that's right. He tore the whole thing up and asked us to sign it again. Afterward, he gave us a tidy sum, told us it was a nest egg for when he was gone." Poirot, ever the detective, leaned forward, his mind working at lightning speed. "After you signed the second time, what did Mr. Marsh do?" Baker hesitated, as if reluctant to give too much away, but Mrs. Baker was quicker. "He went out to the village, paid the tradesmen's bills, seemed a regular enough errand." Poirot seemed unperturbed by this, though I could sense a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "And this?" Poirot asked, pulling the key to the desk into view. "Is this your master's writing?" There was a slight pause before Baker answered, almost too quickly. "Yes, sir, it is." Poirot's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "You're lying," he muttered under his breath. I could feel the tension thickening in the air, and I knew that Poirot was already unraveling something deeper. He pressed on. Have there been any strangers in this house in the last 3 years? No, sir, Mrs. Baker responded. Only Miss Violet. No strangers, not once. Poirot's suspicion deepened. No one? Not even in this very room? The Bakers exchanged a look before Mrs. Baker added, Oh, you forget about the workman, Jim. His wife reminded him. Workman? Poirot's eyes locked onto her, his voice firm and commanding. Workman? What workman? She seemed momentarily flustered. Oh, yes. About 2.5 years ago they came in to do some repairs, but it was all rather unnecessary, really, just a fancy of Mr. Marsh most of the time. They were in the study, though what they did there I couldn't say. Master didn't let us in while they worked. Poirot's mind was already racing. And the firm? Can you remember their name? The Bakers could not recall the name of the firm, though they did remember it was from Plymouth. That was all. Poirot stood, rubbing his hands together with a gleam in his eye. We have progress, Hastings, he said, the words barely escaping his lips. Clearly, your uncle made a second will, one he needed to conceal. But rather than fuss with tearing up floorboards or tapping walls, he called in these Plymouth workmen to create a hidden space, something far more subtle. I nodded, understanding where Poirot was headed. And with a little trouble, he continued, his excitement palpable. We will find the answers we seek. There are always clues, Hastings. We must simply know where to look. After a bit of effort, we tracked down the firm employed by Mr. Marsh. Their employees had been with them for years, a tight-knit group with little room for error. It was a lead, and one that felt tantalizingly close to the truth. The hunt for the hidden will, and whatever dark secrets Mr. Marsh had left behind, was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Finding the 2 men who had worked under Mr. Marsh's orders was no difficult task. The moment we approached them, their memories were sharp and clear. They recounted the job with impressive detail, recalling how, among the various tasks they had performed, they had discreetly altered the old-fashioned fireplace. By removing a single brick and cleverly cutting it, they had created a hidden cavity, so expertly crafted that it was impossible to detect unless one knew the exact mechanism to unlock it. A slight pressure on the second brick from the end, and the entire structure would rise, revealing its secret. Our informant, a tall and gaunt man named Cogan, with a grizzled mustache and a sharp glint in his eye, seemed to have an exceptional memory. His explanation made it clear that the old gentleman had been obsessively fussy about the project, ensuring that every detail was carried out to perfection. His words hung in the air, sending a ripple of excitement through us as we returned to Crabtree Manor, spirits high, eager to put our newly acquired knowledge to the test. With the study door locked behind us, Poirot wasted no time in setting our plan into motion. We moved with meticulous care, pressing against the brick as Cogan had instructed. To our satisfaction, the wall gave way, revealing a deep cavity hidden beneath. Poirot's eyes lit up with triumph as he plunged his hand into the secret space, but in an instant his face fell. The elation that had once danced in his features vanished, replaced by a grimace of consternation. The cavity was empty, save for a single charred fragment of paper. Sacré! Poirot hissed, his frustration evident. Someone has been here before us. We stared at the scrap of paper in silence, our hopes dashed. Clearly, it was a piece of the will, a fragment bearing part of Baker's signature, but there were no clues as to the contents or the terms of the will itself. Poirot sank back on his heels, his mind racing. "I do not understand," he muttered. "Who destroyed this, and what was their motive?" I couldn't help but suggest, "The Bakers? They have no stake in the will, but perhaps they were trying to cover their tracks." Poirot considered this, but dismissed it with a flick of his wrist. "No, Hastings, neither of the wills makes provision for them. They are more likely to be retained by Miss Marsh if the estate remains in her hands, rather than being handed over to a hospital." "But who would destroy it?" I pressed, feeling a chill run through me. "Could it be the hospital's benefit? But who would do such a thing?" Poirot's gaze darkened. "One cannot suspect institutions, Hastings." Perhaps the old man himself grew dissatisfied with the will and destroyed it. I couldn't help but suggest, "Maybe you're right. It could have been a change of heart." Poirot stood up, brushing his knees with his usual precision. "That may be so, Hastings," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "But I will not take credit for your more sensible observation. There is nothing more to do here. We have pitted our wits against the late Andrew Marsh, and yet Miss Marsh is no better off for our efforts." We left Crabtree Manor, our spirits deflated. Hastily, we drove to the station and just managed to catch a train to London, though not the express. Poirot, however, seemed oddly subdued, his face marked by an expression of deep dissatisfaction. I, on the other hand, was weary from the long hours of investigation, and soon drifted off to sleep in the corner. But suddenly, as the train pulled out of Taunton, Poirot's voice cut through the silence with a piercing squeal. "Wake up, Hastings! Jump, I say, jump!" Before I could comprehend what was happening, I found myself standing on the platform, bareheaded and minus my coat, as the train roared off into the night. My anger flared as I sputtered, "What is going on, Poirot?" "Are you mad?" Poirot, utterly oblivious to my frustration, was already deep in thought. "Imbecile that I have been," he muttered to himself. "Triple imbecile. I should have thought of it earlier." I was about to respond in exasperation when he practically ignored me, and, with remarkable decisiveness, began to move toward the station office. "Never mind, Hastings. I cannot be mistaken. The tradesmen's books, I've left them entirely out of account. Yes, of course. We must return at once." "Return?" I asked, still befuddled, but Poirot was already making arrangements. We managed to catch a slow train to Exeter, and Poirot hired a car upon our arrival. The hours ticked away as we drove back to Crabtree Manor, reaching it in the small hours of the morning. The baker's confusion upon our late-night arrival was palpable, but Poirot remained undeterred. Without a word to anyone, he strode straight to the study. "I have not been a triple imbecile," he remarked, his voice low but triumphant. "I have been 36 times 1, my friend." With that, Poirot approached the desk and, with a swift motion, drew out the key and detached the envelope from it. I could hardly contain my curiosity as I watched him open it, my heart racing in anticipation. How could he possibly expect to find a large will form hidden in that tiny, seemingly inconspicuous envelope? It seemed ludicrous, even to Poirot, yet there he was, cutting open the envelope with a steady hand, determined to uncover what secrets it held. Carefully, he laid the envelope flat on the desk, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Poirot, without a moment's hesitation, held the inside surface of the envelope to the flame. The faintest of lines began to emerge, ghostly and indistinct at first, but then with increasing clarity. A slow smile crept across Poirot's face as he leaned in closer. "Look, Hastings," he said, his voice full of triumph. "Look at what we have here." I stared, my heart racing in my chest. There, in delicate, almost imperceptible writing, were the words that would change everything. It was a brief but revealing statement. I leave everything to my niece, Violet Marsh. Dated March the 25th, 12:30 p.m., and witnessed by Albert Pike, confectioner, and Jessie Pike, married woman. I let out a stunned gasp. But is this legal? Poirot chuckled softly, shaking his head. As far as I know, there is no law against writing your will in a blend of disappearing ink and sympathetic ink. The intention of the testator is clear, and the beneficiary is his only living relation. The cleverness of him. He foresaw every step that a searcher might take. It was not enough to write it on regular paper, oh no. He had to be more devious than that. I frowned, trying to piece together the puzzle. So, he used 2 will forms, made the servant sign twice, and then created this trick with the envelope? Exactly. He crafted his little scheme, using an envelope stained with dirt to hold the will, along with a fountain pen containing his secret ink mixture. The confectioner and his wife were his accomplices. He had them sign under his own name. And then he tied the whole thing to the key of his desk, no doubt chuckling to himself as he thought, if my niece figures it out, she will have proven her education worthwhile, and she will be deserving of the inheritance. I stood there, stunned, processing the complexity of the old man's plan. But Miss Marsh didn't see through it, did she? It seems rather unfair. The old man's trickery almost won. Poirot's expression softened slightly, but his eyes gleamed with admiration. Ah, Hastings, this is where you are mistaken. It was Miss Marsh who outwitted him. She proved not only the sharpness of her wits, but the true value of the higher education for women. She knew that in matters such as these, only the expert could truly unravel the mystery. And so, she placed her trust in me. She did not falter, and she has rightfully earned the inheritance. A long pause filled the room as I reflected on Poirot's words. I wonder, I said quietly, what old Andrew Marsh would have thought of it all. Would he have been proud of his niece, or would he have been furious at her success? Poirot's lips curled into a thoughtful smile. That, my friend, is a question that will never be answered. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the case drew to a close, I couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction in knowing that Poirot, as always, had outsmarted them all. But I was left with a lingering question in my mind. Was Miss Marsh the true heir to her uncle's fortune, or was it simply fate that had allowed her to win in the end?